Chanukah is here, and many of us try to fit in a bit of learning for the Chag. But then it hits you. It's also Parshat Miketz. Suddenly there are two topics you want to learn, and almost no time for either. What if you could cover both at once, and walk away with a genuinely insightful understanding of each? And finally understand a mizmor you say every day. And what if you could do it all effortlessly through a podcast? That's exactly what you get in the Chanukah episode of Tehillim Unveiled, the podcast that uncovers the meaning behind the Tehillim that we say every day. This Chanukah, we explore Tehillim 30, Lamed, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, and show how one Mizmor reveals a deep, coherent connection between Chanukah, Parshat Miketz, and your morning davening, all wrapped up in one incredibly relevant message. Whether you're looking for something to learn by the candles or to squeeze in on your commute, this episode gives you real insight and helps the whole week come together. Find a link to the Chanukah special of Tehillim Unveiled in the description of this podcast, or search for Tehillim Unveiled wherever you get your podcasts. If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. Now, let's begin our conversation about Chanukah, Western culture, and the modern world with Rabbi Yitzchok Adlerstein and Rabbi Raphael Hirsch.
Twilight is the metaphorical gap between light and dark, between them and us, the overlap. And we light Chanukah candles at twilight. And we light them not on the inside of our homes of light or the outside of home of darkness, but in between. Chanukah is the festival of the in-between, where we're supposed to grapple with the relationship between light and dark, between them and us, between Yisrael and La'amim. Chanukah is really about going close to another culture and yet not accepting it. And this is the irony, to assimilate it and not be assimilated by it.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. To what degree should we assimilate non-Jewish thought and culture into our intellectual, emotional, and spiritual lives? And to what degree does that question affect the way that we celebrate Chanukah? Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch expressed this tension directly when he wrote the following words. Chanukah represents the clash of two doctrines, two views, two civilizations, capable of molding opinions, training and educating those who, until this very day, compete for the mastery of the world, Hellenism and Judaism. These are the two forces whose effect upon the nations mark the historical development of mankind, and which surfaced in Judea for the first time in the days of Mattathias. Hellenism and Judaism, when examined in depth, they are the two leading forces which, today again, are struggling for mastery in the Jewish world. Today I'm honored to host two Talmidei Chachamim who identify as Hirschians, Rabbi Yitzchok Adlerstein and Rabbi Raphael Hirsch. And despite their shared reverence for the thought of Rav Hirsch, they approach this question and their understanding of Chanukah in very different ways. Rabbi Adlerstein leans into Chanukah as a celebration of Jewish individuality, the need for contrast and clarity. Only when we have a crystal clear awareness of the differences between Torah culture and Hellenic culture can we safely draw from the outside world without losing ourselves. Chanukah, he says, is an expression of Jewish difference. Rabbi Hirsch, in contrast, sees Chanukah quite differently. He believes that Chanukah highlights overlap as well as contrast. He points to the fact that we light candles at twilight, right outside our homes, on the boundary between day and night, between our homes and the outside world, as emblematic of the challenge of going close to another culture without losing our own sense of self. He captures it by saying that we should assimilate it and not be assimilated by it. And then we move this discussion into a direction especially relevant to 2025, because engagement with culture today often refers to something very different from the best of Western thought, It's less Milton and more Netflix, which raises the stakes of this entire debate. So even if we do agree that engaging with Western culture is a net positive, how much should we allow ourselves to be enriched by the low culture of movies and popular music rather than by the high culture of philosophy and classic literature? While Rabbi Zaram and Rabbi Adlerstein bring very different perspectives, what made this conversation such a pleasure is the tone. It's warm, lively, and respectful, even when there's sharp disagreement. This is an important and timely conversation, one which I really enjoyed and couldn't help but participate in as well. And we'll get to it in just a minute. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Yitzchok Adlerstein is the Director of Global Faith Engagement for Israel 365. While living in Los Angeles, he directed interfaith affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and taught Jewish law at Loyola Law School. He runs the Cross Currents blog, co-hosts the Two Rabbis, Three Opinions podcast, and has published books on the Maharal and the Nesivos Shalom. Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zaram is Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies, where he holds the Rabbi Sachs Chair in Modern Jewish Thought, established by the Zandon family. He is also the scholar in residence at the Central Square Minyan in Hampstead. His latest book, Questioning Belief, Torah and Tradition in an Age of Doubt, was a Yeshiva University Book Prize finalist. Rabbi Zaram hosts the Big Questions of Jewish Belief podcast and travels the globe lecturing in Jewish communities and diverse institutions. Rabbi Yitzchok Adlerstein and Rabbi Raphael Zaram, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Our pleasure.
Lovely to be here.
When we tell the Hanukkah story, we're going to get away from the children's version. We understand that the reality was the war was largely Jew against Jew, those people who were called mityavnim, those people who were assimilating into Greek culture, Hellenists that are the real antagonists of the Maccabees. So the question I really want to discuss today, and this is being released on the first night of Hanukkah, is looking at Orthodox life in 2025, and maybe using the term 2025 already indicates that I'm one of the mityavnim too, but Orthodox life in this time. Are we more comparable to these mityavnim, these assimilationists, those Jews who adopted foreign cultures, than we'd like to admit? And of course, the question is, who is the we? So let me open up with you, Rabbi Adlerstein. What do you think about that?
I think that you're onto something, but there's really no comparison. The mityavnim were consciously mityavnim. They, for the most part, came from the upper classes. They were consciously looking for a way to help themselves with the benefits and the accoutrements of Greek culture, Hellenic culture, I should say, and they were quite open about their agenda. At the beginning, it was purely a cultural thing. It wasn't until the time of the Hashmonaim and their rule, that they added their own kind of replacement religion by finding common cause with the Sadducees, with the Tzaddukim. We have a problem of dealing with assimilation, but I don't think it's fair to say that what we're going through today, even when one opens the pages of Mishpacha and sees side by side extolling the virtues of simplicity with what's the back cover today, the current issue, a full cover urging people to buy their cufflinks because cufflinks are a legacy item. The contrast could not be more perfect. But the early Hashmonaim didn't have the advantages that we have today, which is that the ore of Hanukkah, I think it's the Ishbitzer who says that the real nest of Hanukkah was going from a ner to an ore. An air is bounded and restricted. It has a certain volume of oil it can contain and will burn for a certain time. The real Chanukah's Habayis, it's Chanukah, not a building, it's a renewal. That renewal was one in which we saw the flowering of Torah Shabbat Peh. So we have Or v'choshech mishtamshim bi'ervuvia today, light and darkness that are kind of chaotically mixed together. But I think we've come a long way from the openness Yavnim, at least in Orthodox circles. That is not the case outside of Orthodox circles.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Zarin. What do you think in terms of my question, in terms of the current status of mityavnim and assimilation in the Jewish world?
Well, I don't think mityavnim and assimilation are similar things. It's more complicated. And what's interesting is the what was going on at the time. In other words, there's many aspects of Hellenization, whether we're looking politically or socially or religiously and philosophically. And what's fascinating when you look at the Talmud is that the rabbis had a kind of affinity to Greece. Chochmei Atuna, the wisdom of Athens, they related to it. And I do tours of the British Museum on different areas, including Greece. And you go there and it talks about Greek culture venerating the sage. And that was the ideal. And that they looked at other cultures and thought they were foolish, barbarous. They kind of mumbled and said stupid things. They called them barbarians. And the Greeks saw themselves as sophisticated, as intelligent, based on philosophical ideas that had been around, by the time we get to 165 BCE, that had been around hundreds of years, from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. And so when they met the Jews, they were fascinated because the Jews also saw themselves as sophisticated and better than everybody else. Many still do today. And you have these two cultures that venerated thought and didn't just think about violence and action. And they understood each other. There were clearly differences because Greece was dominating, but there was a lot in common. And that's why Chanukah is so interesting, because it's about the similarity between the two, not the difference. I mean, one amazing example, for instance, is olive oil. Right? Why do we light Chanukah candles from olive oil? So we say, oh, because it burns more lighter, the Gemara says. But it's not long-lasting. The Gemara says there are other oils that are more long-lasting. So it seems to be the clarity of the olive oil that's more important. And what's interesting is that the Greeks also venerated olive oil. If you won the Olympics, you got a lifetime supply of olive oil. They looked after their groves and took it very seriously. So there's a huge, and they valued it because of its symbol for wisdom. That's why Athena, the goddess of wisdom, especially strategy and war and so on, is always seen as Athens was named because of the olive tree that she planted. And if you look at the Gemara, well, the one time it talks about, as I mentioned earlier in Shabbos, when it talks about olive oil, it then talks about how you make the ink for a Sefer Torah. And the ink of a Sefer Torah is also made of olive oil. So every letter, traditionally it's changed now, of the Sefer Torah is made of olive oil, which was the symbol of wisdom, just like in Greece. Again, it's the similarity between the two. It's interesting, we talk about Greece being one of the four Galiot, the Galut of Bavel and so on. And the irony of the exile of Galut is we didn't go anywhere. There was no exile. We didn't leave. So it was seen as a kind of internal Galut, this challenge of these two philosophical ideals between us and them. And so Chanukah was a fight of accepting some aspects of Greek culture, thought and ideas, but rejecting others. And that's what's so interesting about it.
I think I would put it quite differently. Sometimes the greatest contrasts between two ideas or two civilizations come from examining how far the overlap goes. In this, I think I would defer to somebody on your side of the pond, Rabbi Zarin, and I'll expect you to reciprocate later by quoting Yogi Berra or something like that. But Matthew Arnold in the late 19th century, I think, put it pithily and quite accurately when he said that the Hellenists discovered the holiness from beauty, while the Jews discovered the beauty of holiness. Sure, there was an overlap. Both of them stressed ideas and the idea of culture, and we don't have to go as far as the Gemara. It's the pasuk in Bereshis, Yafta Elokim li'efes. But we often forget about the end of the pasuk. Yishkon bi'alei shem, the aesthetic, that includes intellectual aesthetics, has to be subject to overview and to the bounds of shame, of what the Maral would call not intellectuality, but seichel. And that seichel coming from a higher place, and that higher place being the seichel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Torah. So that's where I think the similarity between them, the fact that they seem to be chasing the same thing, but wound up in very, very different places, is something that I certainly hope to convey to all those around my table on Hanukkah.
I understand and I agree, but is it about one being harder than the other, or them being complementary and different modes of thought? Because this very much relates to Torah and Chokhmah, or religion and science. And we all take advantage of Greek thought and understanding to this day. The logic, the whole building of physics, mathematics, and then physics, and our ability to have power over this earth, the magisterial manners of Soloveitchik would talk about, comes from Greek culture. Now, on its own, well, Adlerstein, you're absolutely right. It's a dangerous thing, because we also need the kind of value system, the ethics which the Torah teaches us. But I see it as complementary, as opposed to one being subsumed within the other, surely.
I think that still they have to be put on some kind of a continuum with values assigned to different positions on that continuum. The bottom line is that when we study much of what we can, which we have preserved to this day from Greek culture, far more certainly than Roman, we don't make a bracha, even though what we find therein is quite useful, but it doesn't come to the position on the hierarchy that the study of Torah does. And that
and yet we make a bracha when we meet a wise person from amongst the nations. We will make a bracha.
But then there's the difference between Asher Chalak and Asher Nasa. So even within that, we certainly recognize the difference between the two of them. It doesn't mean that we crawl into our corners and are isolationists to say that, we've got it all, and we may have it all. I don't think we can access it all just by the tools that we have within Torah today. And I'm probably more with you than you understand as far as recognizing all that we can and should take from secular society, even today, when so many people have given up on that process entirely.
I would agree with you and say both are a blessing, and we make a mistake when we try and make science out of our Torah, or to make Torah out of science. Right? It's respecting the differences between the two as well as important. But I'm not going to quote from your side of the pond. I apologize, but I'll quote Winston Churchill, who talks about the great knowledge comes from Athens and Jerusalem, and the lessons to the world are manifold from both, he says. And then he says, personally, I've always been on the side of both. And he's kind of recognizing both of those.
Okay, let me interrupt here just for a moment, because Rabbi Zareb, I'd like to push back just a little bit in your conciliatory attitude towards Greek culture. Now, I'm not disagreeing with that attitude, but I'm wondering if that really is the message of Chanukah, meaning when we look at the liturgy of Chanukah, in particular Al Hanisim, it sets up Athens and Jerusalem as complete opposites. It sets up the Syrian Greeks as the enemy. We are presented as those who defeated those who are trying to destroy everything we hold dear. While these strains you're talking about certainly do exist in Torah literature, I would be surprised myself to say that's the theme of Hanukkah. Almost, I'd say there are different times to appreciate different things. Hanukkah might be the time to say this is where we're different, not to say this is where we are the same. I'm curious what you would think about that as well as Rabbi Adlerstein. And let me just conclude by saying that it's doubly ironic because in the world, and sometimes it includes the Orthodox world, the degree to which we treat Hanukkah like an assimilationist holiday rather than the anti-assimilationist holiday is frightening. Even, this isn't Hanukkah, but it's related to it, even the very fact that the Israeli Olympics is called the Maccabiyah. Are we saying that we are Chalashim, which is what the liturgy said? We are weak? No, it's because we compare the Maccabees to the Greek army or the Greek Olympians. The problem is that the whole point of Hanukkah is saying we were weak and yet we won anyway. Saying that we were like the Greeks is, I realize it does come from an actual Zionist way of looking at things, an early Zionist secular way of looking at things, but it's saying God's not involved. We were strong. And that undermines the entire message of Chanukah. So I'm curious how you understand Chanukah. Chanukah itself might sort of undermine the message you're trying to say.
Well, I don't really see it that way. I mean, for me, first of all, there are moments when cultures that we relate to turn on us and do terrible things. Adlerstein himself made a very good point that for a long time we lived quite well under Greek thought. We name our kids after one of the Alexander. It's an incredible connection that we had. It was only when it turned bad and they misused their political power that we turned against. But until then, we really very much related to them. And that's what's so interesting. So for me, it's about the danger of Chanukah is to become fundamentalist about it and to think we should always reject all of this. In Hellenism, it makes a very big play about the difference. I agree with you. But Ma'at Tzor is the reverse. Ma'at Tzor talks about how we were connected to culture after culture. It takes a close reading of the text, but it's really a poem about how we survived each time, but in a way we absorb part of that culture around us. We still maintain our difference. We absorb that culture. And so for me, Chanukah is about the in-between times. You know that Gemara where it talks about, he asks, he wants to, he studied all of Torah and now he wants to learn Greek culture. And the Rav's response is, well, you can learn it. We're supposed to learn Torah day and night. So learn it when it's not day or night. Now you can read it on a Peshat level of never, or you could read it as what's between day and night? Twilight. Twilight is the metaphorical gap between light and dark, between them and us, the overlap. And we light Chanukah candles at twilight. And we light them not on the inside of our homes of light or the outside of home of darkness, but in between. Chanukah is the festival of the in-between, where we're supposed to grapple with the relationship between light and dark, between them and us, between Yisrael and La'amim, and between those two worlds. So Chanukah is really about going close to another culture and yet not accepting it. And this is the irony, to assimilate it and not be assimilated by it. It's ironic. If you look up the word assimilate, the primary meaning is that I assimilate something else. If we teach well today, our audience will assimilate, will assimilate what we have taught them. Okay? But the tertiary meaning, the defensive meaning, is to be assimilated. That's a failure, and that's what's happened. Jews are on the run. Jews are afraid. And so some Jews will choose to put up very big walls because they're afraid. Others are very foolish, don't have any walls at all, right? And go out there and get assimilated, right? The challenge is to assimilate our culture into the wider world and to be part of it. There are huge dangers. And Chanukah is, on one hand, a real warning, but also a real opportunity. That's a complex and subtle balance, lost on children. And it's fine just to run around with things and cry things. But as adults, having read what the Talmud says about it and looking at these texts, I think we're obliged to see those nuances.
Rabbi Adlerstein?
I appreciate what Rabbi Zimmerman is doing, and it's a message that often is ignored. But I do think that different times on the calendar are meant to teach us different lessons that we focus on at that time, not to the exclusion of other things. So it would be quite tasteless to run athletic competitions on Sukkot, on Shavuos, because Shavuos is the time that we focus entirely on the gift and the majesty of Matan Torah, of Hashem giving us the Torah. I think that Chanukah is a time when we do, in a sense, the opposite of what Rabbi Zimmerman is suggesting, in order to get to the very point that he would like to get us to. It's by understanding the contrast, which can be subtle to some people, the real difference between Hellenic culture and Torah culture. The difference, as some would say, between chitzoniyut and pnimiyut. Everything about Hellenic culture was there out in the open. I've often asked Talmidim in the past, why is it that Greek athletes never got rich on Nike endorsements? And the answer is because they competed in the nude, because you found the holiness of the God in the bilateral symmetry and the beauty of the human body. while on the next hill, on the Beit HaMikdash, the holier something was, the more it was covered up. To stress the idea that it's what's internal, both on Har HaBayit and in the human psyche. Things that are the most treasured are covered up. It's only when we have crystal clear awareness of the difference between the gifts of Athens that we can dip into some of their wells, as he called it before, a complementary to the gifts of Torah. But we have to know that there are essential differences, and never the twain shall meet.
I would actually suggest, before turning it over to you, Rafi, it might even be parallel to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Of course, we want compassion, but on Rosh Hashanah, we're emphasizing the fact that God is king and judge. Once we've internalized the reality that God has the right to judge us, at that point, we're now ready to ask for compassion, to ask for forgiveness, despite the fact that we may not deserve it. But I think the sequential nature of them is first we have to internalize a message of Rosh Hashanah before we can get to the message of Yom Kippur. And we can take this with all sorts of different dualities out there. And I tend to identify more with Rabbi Adlerstein's approach to Chanukah, not because I think that your conclusion is wrong. I agree, and I think we all are in agreement that we have to assimilate, in the sense that you said, the best of Greek culture into our lives. But that can only happen, and this is how I read Hanukkah at least, once we've understood that they are fundamentally different. Once we've really internalized that difference, then we can move forward and say, okay, now that I really am strong in what I am, in my own identity, and I won't lose my identity if I did Hanukkah properly, let me see what I can take from them that won't undermine my identity, but will instead enrich my identity.
Yeah, but the problem with that approach is it's always seeing it as a them and us. And if our aim was to be part of this world, ever since from Avraham, to be a blessing to the world, we have to understand this complementarity in its depth. So when Rav Adlerstein talks about difference, right, we highlight the difference, but to understand difference, you have to understand what is different and what is not different. And if you do a biological process, is it about separation or difference? It's about both at the same time. Most fundamentally, it's about understanding the other, not turning them into a pure enemy that they're always wrong about everything, but understanding where we agree and where we disagree, just like we are doing now in a conversation, right? If it's about loggerheads to say, I ultimately am different from you because we have a different ideology or we're different people, then we'll never converse with each other. The aim always has to be is what do we relate to each other in and what do we see as different? So I don't see it as first working out what I am. That's like before you go into a negotiation or relationship between, say, two warring countries or two people having an argument saying, well, I'm not going to compromise on this before I go into the meeting. But the whole point is the overlap of the relationship and knowing the dangerous lines. So I'm fully a big believer on separating from a world outside that's not common. But I remember 3 years ago, Daniel Tobe, who was the ambassador he's English, but he became the ambassador to London. He said to me, first night Hanukkah, he invited the Greek ambassador for dinner. And they had a few academics there from the university, and they talked about the wonders of Greek philosophy and what it gave for the world, and Torah philosophy, and the differences and similarities. And he said it was a wonderful evening. But I'll give you, I think, my favorite metaphor for this, which is the menorah itself. The very last line of Ma'atzur, of the longer version, Hakim lanu im shiva, raise for us the 7 shepherds. Right? And when I used to sing that as a kid, I know everyone it's talking about. So I looked it up, and there's a Gemara in Sukkah that says it's based on a pasuk in Micha. Who are the 7 shepherds? And then the Gemara says the wildest thing. It describes it, and I don't know the exact wording, but I'll do my best. It says, in translation, it says Adam, Shet, and Mutushalach on the left, and Avraham, Yaakov, and Moshe on the right, and David in the middle, which adds up to 7. Now, when I read that, and I looked at the commentaries, no one really says it, although it's obvious maybe, it's describing a menorah. 3 on one side, Adam, Shet, and Metushelach, Adam, Seth, and Methuselah, and 3 on the left, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. And obviously the difference between the two is the ones on one side are universal. They're before Avraham. They're the universal history of humankind, which I would argue Greek culture represents. That's what Adam and Seth and Methuselah are. Whereas Abraham, Jacob and Moses are clearly our tradition, our particularity. And in the middle, you have David. Why David in the middle? Because David, Santa Simolenu Melach, we wanted to have a king like the other nations. It's literally the one or the major area, Malchut, where the Torah, we talk about being like them. So David is in the middle between the two. And what's fascinating is the halacha that every child learns about a Chanukah that makes it kosher is that all the lights have to be the same height. So I'll use the advantage of people might be watching this, which is that if your menorah is skew-if and one side is lower than the other, it's not kosher. By definition, halachically, they have to be in a shura, in a straight line. You have to balance the universal and the particular. Now, the Shamus does that, and this is why I 100% agree with Adlerstein, which is David HaMelech. You have to know who was both a poet and a very spiritual man and also a physical man. We have to have someone who teaches us how to balance between the two. I mean, amazingly, David's name itself is a Chanukah, right? You've got Daled on one side and Daled on the other, and your Vav Shamus in the middle, and it's beautifully balanced. So Chanukah is about the balance between those two areas, and that's why it became the symbol for the state of Israel, which is, in its basic laws, a Jewish and democratic state. Notice Jewish comes first, but it has both. Now they're fiddling with it. But those challenges, Jewish and democratic state for me is literally Israel, Jerusalem and Athens. It's amazing it's really built in there, and the menorah reflects that. But it's about the relationship between those two. We have to be engaged with the world. If we just venerate one, the exclusion or the rejection of other, or limited way, we miss the point. That's why I love the fact the pipes of the classic menorah all overlap with each other. So what's the relationship between these two worlds? So that is the challenge. And my teacher, Rabbi Sachs, that's what he always would look at, the deeper issue underneath the argument. So, when in this country of Adlerstein, I don't know, the new atheists were really giving us a hard time. They put adverts on buses saying, God doesn't exist, just get on with your life. I mean, it was really flexing their muscles about it. And there were no religious Christian leaders who had the ability to respond, and Rabbi Sachs did. And his book, he said, I don't want to have a fight between religion and science, between the rabbis and the scientists. I want to recognize that more deeply there's a great partnership. And he called his book The Great Partnership, to explain the value of each and the danger of what, and he writes very powerfully about the danger when we lose that. In Renaissance Italy, we had a wonderful religious humanism and a marrying of the two. But then he describes very darkly how it all went wrong and why we have to be so careful. But at its heart, it's a great partnership.
And I'd like to hear Rabbi Adlerstein's response. I would ask one question, though, which I'm asking to both of you, although I'll let Rabbi Adlerstein speak first. When you speak about the great partnership between religion and science, that's not the same thing as between Jewish and Hellenistic culture, because culture contains much more than simply information. It contains other influences that we do have to be careful with. And in that book, The Great Partnership, Rabbi Sachs, I don't think, was speaking about Jews and Greeks so much as religion, universal or Jewish, and the scientific enterprise, and things that can be proven as facts. As he said, something along the lines of, science tells us how it works and religion tells us what it means. They are different roles. But culture is much more all-encompassing, and that's the part that I have a hard time really being able to accept, even though I'm largely in agreement. But in terms of the message of Chanukah and the importance of knowing who we are, even as you said, before we walk into a negotiation, well, of course, you have to know what your red lines are. When you go in, first you're coached. Okay, don't give in on this, don't give in on this. This you can give in on. So as I've said, I'm largely in agreement with your philosophy of Judaism. I don't necessarily agree with seeing that as part of what Chanukah is about, because for me, Chanukah is about that conflict which we need to expound upon and understand before we can determine which ideas and ideals are compatible with and will even enrich Judaism. Rabbi Adlerstein?
Well, the sad news is that I'm going to have to report Rabbi Zaram to the Attorney General for implying that there's some connection between the menorah in front of Knesset and the Chanukah. One has 7 branches, one has 8 branches, but to imply that there's any connection, I believe in the eyes of the Supreme Court, at least the Attorney General, will be deemed unconstitutional and a violation of one of the basic laws. If you have to hide, I'm willing to cover for you over here if you want to take refuge. I'm more comfortable in looking at the 7 branch menorah, not the Chanukah, and the Shiva Roim, the seven shepherds, being the ones that I think were much more known and in vogue at the time that the lyrics of Mosur were written, which is that the Shivaroim, the seven shepherds, are Avram, Yitzchok, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, and yeah, did I skip Yosef? Yeah, skip Yosef. And they in turn linked to the seven lower sphirot. And the menorah, the seven branch menorah, is seen so often. Of course, it depends on the century, as emblematic of the Chochmah of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Shemen Hatov Yored al Bnei HaMenorah.
So how would you explain that Gemara in Sukkah then, when it literally describes the seven in the shape of a menorah, the only time where we have seven characters described with the physical image of a menorah?
So Estata'ai Ani Masker Hayom, I don't remember that Gemara in Sukkah, which probably means that something in my brain said, yeah, you don't understand that, so forget about it, which is not a midah. So please tell me later what daf that's on, and I'll be glad to.
Sukkah 52b. I just looked it up. So if you look at Sukkah 52b, it's a great source there. It says it's there.
Okay. As far as the idea of not going into a relationship when you come into the negotiations with a very clear understanding or a very parochial understanding of your position, I would give a different marshal. You can't create what the Maral calls a Havaya, which is Shalom B'derech HaTeva, a creation of a new existence that is not really something that naturally occurs, marriage. And you don't go into marriage properly without two people, each of whom is confident about his or her own identity. When there's a blurring of that, you wind up with a troubled marriage. When you don't have the boundaries that are needed or the expectations, the realities of full personhood. And I think that's what we need, and that's what Chanukah really is out to give to us, the essential knowledge of the difference between Chachmas HaTorah, between the Torah that comes from the Chachma, the wisdom that comes from Torah, and that which is man-made, even if that man-made wisdom has much to offer us. I will tell you, Rabbi Zara, that ironically, after I finish this podcast, I go into my weekly Maral shir, followed by a webinar with a evangelical Christian academic group, where I'll be sharing the platform with a wonderful Christian academic who happened to have been a student of David Flusser, someone whose work I'm sure you're aware of.
I'm really glad it's you doing that, representing us, seriously. And studying the Maharal, who is absolutely fascinating on these issues. You know, his philosophical grasp and the question historically of how much he was influenced or knowledgeable about the thought of his time really fascinates me. The marriage one is a great one to talk about, because what's the aim of a marriage, though? V'hayu lebasar echad. So how do you explain that in your metaphor?
This comes, Rabbi Zarin, back to what Chazal say, that originally they were one person with two faces, and God separated them. If they were really supposed to be basar echad, a single flesh, united in a literal type of way, then there was no need for God to separate them in the first place. They already were basar echad. But God wanted first to separate them so that they could achieve individuality only after they had been separated from each other, and they were not a single individual, but two separate individuals. Only after they had achieved that individuality could they then come together into a new united type of being, a basar echad. It's predicated on first being separate. Aside from that, there's also the fact that Rashi says that basar echad doesn't refer to them at all, but refers to their child.
It's interesting, because that imagery is in Greek culture 600 years before the Talmud. So you wonder where it comes, or the Midrash. So you wonder where it comes from. Are we willing to admit that there are ideas in the oral law, or influenced by the rabbis, influenced by which they brought into Torah, or not? Are we willing to admit that or not? Because to admit it is problematic, because it means that we're not saying our Torah is pure, but to not admit it is to ignore lots of historical documentation that shows very clearly that that's the case. So, what do we do with those things? So, I would argue we have no problem absorbing, assimilating it in if it's the Rabbanim, the Chazal, deem that it came from a pure source, that it was an aspect of Emet. The Rambam says we can learn truth from outside. There's in the Torah and science books, because I study physics. That's my PhD actually. It's not in a Jewish subject. It was in physics. I was always interested in all these religion and science books. So I read the book of Judah Landau, that really early one, Torah and Science. And he gives a wonderful example where they're talking about issues of kilayim, with circular fields and square fields. And the Mishnah are very difficult to understand how it all fits together with the overlap and so on. And so I think it's the on the Shulchan Aruch that says, if you say, he says, that Pythagoras' theorem only applies to squares and not rectangles, then I can make the Mishnah work. And he explains it that way. And then Rav Kara, right, and it responds and says, that's ridiculous. What do you mean Pythagoras' theorem only, it's literally all in the little Rashi there. Well, I looked it up once. What do you mean the Pythagoras' theorem only applies to squares? It applies to rectangles as well. You don't understand the Mishnah. And if you have to limit a scientific, a proof or fact, however you want to define it, in order to then you don't understand it. Sachs quotes originally, Darwin wrote in one of the early versions of his Origin of Species, he quotes Francis Bacon, who says that, or going back 500 years or 400 years, saying that, God's words and God's works cannot by definition contradict, right? And God's works are physical reality and theories we've deduced, Pythagoras' theorem, and God's words are the Torah and ultimately the Mishnah. And if they contradict, you've either misunderstood the Mishnah or misunderstood science. But if the science is strong, and Pythagoras is, there's 30 different proofs about it, then you've got to rework the Mishnah to make more sense of that. And so I love that example because it's truly respecting. You have an example of in the Shulchan Aruch of saying you can't just reject the scientific knowledge of our time. I wonder if we as Rabbanim today know enough about science, about psychology, about technology to properly discern, and we do it well. I mean, a great example is the use of Kindles on Shabbat. Do you remember when it all started, before they had backlights? There was a big debate that actually it might not be so problematic if there's no backlight to it. And then in terms of its energy and using it, it might be breaking our malach of Shabbat. Right? And there was debates about that. And then what happened? We all realized how terrible social media was. And even more liberal Orthodox rabbis, no one wanted to engage with the fact that you could maybe use this stuff on Shabbat. But any subject that's done, and I was a big fan of Darnell Troy, who was the head of our Bet Din in the UK for years. And he would always say when he involved in a new aspect of medicine or technology, he would research it. He would sit in medical conferences to fully understand the science before giving a pasuk on what you do with it, how you can use it and how you can't use it. So you have to fully engage and understand and appreciate this amazing knowledge that we have, and then say, well, can we use it? Well, can't we use it? And when is it mamish treif? I get that. But you have to engage with it. So for me, that's what Chanukah is. Engaging with it in order to understand how it can be used for good and how it can be used for evil. But if you go in and say, well, I'm not going to look at things properly, you'll never understand anything. So, you have to do equations to understand them. You can't just sit on the side and go, well, I'm not sure I'm going to accept that until you know what it is.
I have a confession to make, and that is that I'm a out of the closet Hirschian. So I certainly am not one to reject outside Chochmah. Influences is a coded word. This is going to take a whole other podcast or series of podcasts, because I think you could say simplistically that the point that you made about not cutting ourselves off from the possibility that there may have been earlier influences even on the development of Torah Shabbat Peh, fundamentally is on focus the Rambam, who says, yeah, it's possible, and the Gra, who says, no way. And there was a terrible mistake that the Rambam made, and perhaps the Maral as a bridge figure, as he's sometimes been called, between the worlds of secular knowledge and the specialness of Torah. I think it's wise to recall that the Rambam himself, who's certainly excuse the expression, the patron saint of your position, perhaps. In his famous letter to I forgot who, said when he was accused of spending too much time in secular studies, said that, look, Torah has been his loyal, faithful, beloved wife from the time of his youth. That is where his heart is. But he can't say he's not attracted to some beautiful women on the other side, and he has had relationships with them as well. But the part that is often not quoted, the Rambam says that Shamayim will be my witness. Then everything that I've taken from those mistresses has only been, in my mind, in the service of Torah. So there's a lot to unpack there, a lot to be said. And still coming back to the point of what Chanukah is, I think that Chanukah still is about the clarity of how we are different from everything else out there. And ironically, I would say that the time to make your point would be Sukkot, the time that we move from insularity to a consideration of the 70 nations of the world, bring karbanos for them. And as some of the Bali Machshava have pointed out, it's only because it is a time of simcha. And at a time of simcha, which is expansive, we could move to take in much of what is beyond our own borders and boundaries.
That's a great challenge, great point, and it makes me think because I've always felt, bringing korbanot on behalf of the nations is like saying I do interfaith when I show Christians around my school, but I won't go to their schools. It's not really an engagement. Whereas Chanukah, I think, really was an engagement because, here's a good question today. The Maccabees were extremists. They were fundamentalists. They rejected all of Greek culture. And if we're idealizing them, then, I see myself as a Hirschian as well. Then us Hirschians are out the window, right? We want to be much more extreme. But the irony of the Maccabees is they all assimilated. It all went wrong afterwards, right? Because they didn't understand the balance themselves. They got so into saying, I'm going to reject, because you've attacked me, and we were attacked horrifically, we're going to reject everything. And I believe we threw the baby out with the bathwater. We made a huge mistake. And actually, Chanukah is the rabbis reflecting on that moment, on it. And the whole debate about is the battle about the oil or about the war, for me, is about the difference between the oil is the philosophy and the war is the cultural battle. And that we might have won the physical war, but we didn't understand the difference between those two things, and we still have to engage with both of those. So I don't think it's so neat for that. And for Sukkot, for me, well, it's a whole other story. Sukkot is very different. But look at the story of Hannah and her 7 sons. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, there's many metaphor versions of it, but all those fights is because when another culture tries to dominate another one, we reject. We don't, we don't even tie a shoelace. We'll reject. If you try and attack us, well, is there anything of you? And I won't dress like you just to be different. But if you're not attacking me, then I don't mind so much. And so, or I will relate to it. So for me, it's not about the separateness of Torah. To say that is to not put the Chanukah in the window. It's to not do it at twilight. It's to be in the broad daylight. I don't want to call it Kodesh and Chol. A Havdalah, I talk about that separation because I'm recognizing there are separations in the world. But Chanukah for me is about the similarity, not the difference. And that's why I do it at that time and in that place.
Okay, I'd like to interrupt over here because we could continue this conversation for a very long time, and it's fascinating, but I want to make sure we cover some other aspects in terms of the modern world today. So far, we've cited Francis Bacon, Darwin, Matthew Arnold, Winston Churchill, Yogi Berra, and all of those are examples of high culture, clearly, especially the last. But I would suggest that very often in the modern world, much of what is called Western culture or engagement with Western culture is not what either of you have been talking about. It is not talking about Shakespeare as much as talking about a 16-plus movie on Netflix. So the question really becomes, in the modern world, when we're engaging with other cultures, and let's work with that Hirschian ideal of engaging with outside cultures being a positive. At the same time, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal had in mind something very different when he talked about the importance of reading Milton from what most people 99.9%, I would say, in the modern Orthodox world at least, are talking about when they talk about engaging in Western culture, which has very little to do with Milton and much more to do with music, TV shows, low culture, things that are very, very different. And also, I'll just mention, Rabbi Adlerstein, you talked about mishpacha before, and that is a good example of some sort of assimilating of a type of low culture. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but popular culture. It's a Jewish magazine, an Orthodox magazine, but it's using the mechanisms, the kelim, the vessels, the language of Yavan, so to speak, in order to transmit its message. So, Rabbi Zaram, let me start with you. How do you see modern engagement with secular culture, taking the ideals that you're suggesting we should do, when so much of secular culture now, we're not talking about physics or Milton. We're talking about things that are much more popular and very often perhaps contain things that are negative.
Well, now's a moment of confessions, and Rabbi Adlerstein's going to have to defend me even more. But, I grew up not with so much high culture. They tried to teach me Shakespeare, and eventually I absorbed, but I watched a lot of movies, a lot of action processes. And then I started studying mythology and stories. And you know what? Most movies, there's well-made movies and badly made. They can be popular, well-made, and popular, badly made. But I'm talking about well-made movies that actually do well and people watch them because they tell a good story, is they reinforce over and over again the success of good over evil. And all your Marvel movies and Batman and DC movies reinforce the importance of family, of selflessness, and of good. It happens over and over again. Just a clip I put on Facebook today in the first, when they did an X-Men first class, they went back and showed the origin of the X-Men. As you know, Magneto is Jewish. And there's an amazing moment, he can move metal, where he's young, and he's trying to move this huge metal dish. And he's a very angry person. He's very much about never again. And he's trying to move it. He can't do it. And Xavier, who's this great professor, says, "Can I tap into your mind?" And it's on the screen, by the way. It's an amazing clip. He taps into his mind, and you see on the screen an image of Magneto's mother lighting Chanukah candles. And then Magneto says to him, "What did you do to me?" And he goes, "I accessed brightest part of your memory." And Magneto said, "I forgot I had that." And he goes, "Yes, you've forgotten a lot of what you are, but if you can tap into that and let go of anger and get to serenity, you can achieve more than you could have possibly imagined." And then he says, "Try it again." And this time he moves the dish. And I sat there in the cinema going, they're doing Hanukkah. Literally, they're doing Hanukkah. This mighty Jew who hates the world because of what he was a survivor of the Shoah and says never again, right, is trying to be taught that actually use your power not out of hate, but out of love. And peace will come to our people when we defend ourselves 100% and fight for ourselves, but not out of hate, but out of right, not out of bitterness, but out of good things. So in this, what you call low culture, if it's good low culture as a bad, cheap low culture, there's a lot of truth and meaning there. And again, I didn't search for this because I unfortunately had a wasted childhood growing up on this. I just know it. And when I learned then Torah, I saw Torah reinforced time and again, time and again.
Okay, so I want to hear Rabbi Adlerstein's response. But before that, Rabbi Zaram, I want to quickly ask you a question which might be unfair. But first, let me emphasize that when I use the term low culture, I do not mean that in a derogatory sense. I'm using the term low culture to contrast it with high culture. Low culture means it's more popular, but it's not a positive or negative value judgment at all. Let me also acknowledge that while I happen to not like superhero movies that much, I do engage in plenty of popular or low culture myself. I'm not pretending that I don't do that as well. Although I will say that if I did watch superhero movies, I would probably watch DC movies more than Marvel because I have a familial connection. It happens to be that my father's first cousin, Jeanette Kahn, was the longtime president and publisher of DC Comics. Regardless, my question for you, Rabbi Zaram, is this. When you describe seeing something very positive portrayed on the screen in a movie, did you learn that from watching that movie? Or did it simply reinforce something you already know? That's what the difference might often be. In high culture, you learn something new. You discover something that you hadn't previously known. But I'm guessing, Rabbi Zaram, your knowledge of Chanukah and the Jewish story was not taught to you by Magneto. It was instead reinforced or simply echoed. Isn't that true?
Yes, sometimes, and this was at two different levels where you just, and I teach rabbis, and I say, when you do a sermon, you quote something from culture. Are you doing it to reinforce something you already knew? Because you learned from it for the culture outside. So occasionally I learn from outside. in the most dramatic moment in the Avengers movie when they all work together and finally the Hulk turns up, right? And he's just a regular guy, and then all the aliens are coming towards him, and they go, "Now would be a really good time, to turn green, right? Are you going to have to get yourself angry?" And he turned down, he goes, "Don't you understand? That's my secret. I'm always angry." And he just turns on the spot. Ezer Gibor Koveshet Yitzro is not the kibush, doesn't mean, and I realized that at that point, or more so, the anger goes away. Kibush means I have that anger, that energy is inside me all the time, but I can breathe with it. I don't pretend it doesn't exist, and I haven't destroyed my desires. I just live with it. So there are moments when I've seen in these movies ideas that help me on a sheer that they say what I say, and they add another aspect to it, which really challenge me. Sometimes I don't like it. I disagree with it. Sometimes I go, oh, I've got to think about that. Maybe that means something different. So yes, indeed, I do learn some things.
Okay, that's totally fair. Rabbi Adlerstein?
So my preference in comics starts with and probably ends with Superman. And the biggest lesson to be learned there, and one that 99.9% of people on the face of the earth don't realize, is that if you go back to Superman's original name, it has, as did his father, the Shem Hashem built into it.
Absolutely.
So that for me that's my lodestar. We always got to figure out what it is that the Ribono Shalom is thinking. I think Scott, that what you're looking for is some consideration of the pragmatic aspects of low culture. I wrote a piece recently for Jewish Action on it. I don't even know if it was published yet. They're doing some kind of looking back at 25, 30, whatever it is, years of Jewish Action, and asking some of us old timers who were around at the beginning what changes have taken place. And I wrote my piece on this high culture, low culture thing, and that to me, one of the signal accomplishments of the Orthodox community in the last couple of decades is the development of an independent low culture. But independent is relative, because they are the boundaries, the walls that we build, even those who have walls, are very, very porous. And I know every generation says this, and I have to be very careful, because anything I say now, my wife is going to use against me. Many of us perceive that there are real differences between low culture today and the Leave It to Beaver generation, which is even before my time. I remember Rav Soloveitchik, commenting on the secular music of his day. And he said, a lot of people think that the problem is the lyrics. The lyrics are horrible, true, but a much greater damage is occasioned by simply the beat, by the thing where Yehuda Halevi extolled the magic of music, that it could summon up all kinds of different emotions. And Rav Soloveitchik was not happy with that. Try to think of what happens to you when you're treated to a diet of what currently goes for music. How many minutes can you listen to Eurovision as a frum Jew without getting totally turned off? But our kids are not turned off, and that is a real problem. It's a real problem that those who manufacture Jewish music don't realize to what extent they're entirely beholden to the musical figures of the secular world, and have just incorporated it and put Jewish lyrics to it.
Exactly.
That's a real problem. Besides, there's another problem in the low culture of today. Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. It was a chiddush in his day. Today, actually, literally today, the Israeli government has announced that starting February 2nd, cell phones will be banned in Israeli public schools, at least in elementary schools. And they cited nothing religious, nothing to do with Chanukah, but simply the evidence of permanent changes in learning, and even in brain structure, for people being wed to these objects. So I think a case can be made. Again, my wife is going to give me grief for this, because, how come you never admitted to this? How come you never admitted this to me before? Why were we always fighting about this? But my wife is right. that there are dangers around in low culture today that didn't exist 50 years ago. Many people have used that as an excuse to shut out everything good in the outside world, which is why I appreciate your position, Rabbi Zara. But we have to go into this with our eyes open. We need more protection today, more self-censorship, more, I'll use the word, walls, barriers, boundaries than ever before.
I agree. But it's interesting, the walls aren't from that culture. The walls are from the misuse of it. And humanity all is suffering from that issue and facing up to it. And you know what's interesting? If you look at American schools, dealing with the response to usage of phones, right? There are some non-Jewish or just general schools out there in America who are much more advanced and sophisticated about doing it than Jewish schools are. And the Jewish schools that engage with the government plans on it are actually doing better. See, it's ironic. It's not about us and them. It's about it's the humanity that we have to help and try and fix. You know what I find interesting? It's just an example. Maybe it's not relevant, but it just came to me. Is Christmas decorations. You know, I've got no problem playing with Christmas decorations because I spent time in Israel, and you know, there's Jews will use them for their Sukkot in Israel because secular Israelis have no connection to Christmas out there, so they don't do association. They have fun with it, and I will play with these things. And I've sometimes done this in front of progressive or non-religious Jews, and they're shocked. They say you mustn't use Christmas decorations because that's them, that's not us. But because I'm steeped in my own tradition, I don't mind using them. I'm completely comfortable because they don't have that association with me. So I kind of agree with you in many ways. If we bring up people who are truly rooted in their faith, right, then they can go outside and they'll always translate it in that sense. They'll see a value about there and not be afraid of it. But at the same time, we mustn't be naive about it. And the pernicious power of social media is destroying our minds. I 100% agree. But I don't see that as Greek or secular or as alien. I see that as just technology. I mean, for me, philosophically, it's the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is not Ra. It's uncontrolled. You know that where the Yetzer Hara wouldn't get married, wouldn't build anything. Yetzer Hara is like nuclear, which I learned from one Rav taught me, it's like nuclear energy. Is nuclear energy good or bad? Nuclear energy can power an entire civilization or decimate and destroy the planet. It all depends on the rods. It all depends on the control of it. So I don't see the Yetzer Hara as alien, as secular. I see it as human. And the Yetzer Tov is morality on top of it. We have a go with our approach. And, you know, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle definitely with his golden mean and was, what does it mean to live the good life, which still engages philosophers across the world, was also their attempts at the Yetzer Tov on top of it. And we need to reach out and partner with these people, right? The religions of the world, and you're doing it from what you're saying, need to meet together, not to do face-to-face dialogue, what's your idea of God, what's not, but side by side to bring and reaffirm morality into common culture. Absolutely, absolutely. But our aim is to go into that place, right? And to just think about ourselves, and we have to, you're not saying this, but you know what I mean. That idea, we've just got to survive. Survive for what? Survive for what? There was always a purpose. And that midrash of Avraham as a bottle of perfume, and Hashem said, I had to take the lid off so that the perfume, this beautiful smell, could reach the whole world. I see many very religious Jewish leaders to the right putting the stop on the bottle really tight so nothing escapes. Right? And the perfume, by the way, doesn't smell inside the bottle either because it needs to engage with the air in order to truly smell. That's my metaphor of what's gone on. We need to let the perfume out, let the Torah out of the bottle.
Yes, indeed, but it may start with a very strong sense of identity, of keeping the home as a fortress, literally as a fortress. And that means both keeping the wrong influences out, but also making it a safe haven for the blessings, for the ha'ara, the divine illumination that HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects us to have, so that only once we are very confident of building the kind of bucket of a Jewish home, Rav Kook famously said, why is the mitzvah of Chanukah Mer Ish Ubeito? instead of devolving upon each individual, because it's in the clash of values between Torah and Hellenic and Hellenistic cultures. The medium of conveying those differences is the home. If we have the homes built solidly on Torah values, then we can venture forth from those homes to take the mission on the road. And I suspect, Rabbi Zarin, that you are insidiously trying to steer this conversation in a different direction, and implying that if the Haredi world here in Eretz Yisrael would be doing a little bit better of a job of opening up to the possibility of something good and valuable on the outside, and to training people within to be stronger messengers and to be stronger in their own confidence of what they believe in, then we'd have more people drafting for the Israeli army. And I will gladly drink to that with you. And it doesn't matter whether it's scotch for your side of the pond or bourbon on mine.
As we're coming close to the end of our conversation, I have one final question. I will say that the conversation here does remind me of the big machloket when we talk about Ner Ishu Beito, the candle of Chanukah outside the person's house. What is its purpose? Is it to shine out into the street or to shine from the street into the person's house? That's an interesting question which relates to this. Rav Kook in 1932 at the opening of the Mizrahi Teachers College spoke about the Gemara in Baba Kama Daf Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, which says, Lashon Yevani L'chud, Chochma Yevanit L'chud. The language of the Greeks is one thing and must be separated and distinguished from the wisdom of the Greeks. The language of the Greeks, read that as the vessels that we use to convey, read Mishpacha magazine, etc. That is wonderful. We have to use that in order to try and further Torah culture, to use the language, the externals in order to do so. However, Rav Kook was very wary and very against filling those vessels with any kind of chokhmat yivanit, any kind of wisdom that belongs to the outside world. Rav Kook might have said, perhaps naively, that academic approaches to Torah are fine. That's the vessel, but we have to make sure that what goes into it is Torah alone and not something which is outside of Torah. I don't know if either of you will agree with Rav Kook, and obviously a great figure of Rav Kook. I don't want you to disagree with him necessarily, but how do you respond? How do you relate to Rav Kook? I'll ask you, Rabbi Adlerstein, and then we'll conclude with Rabbi Zarim.
I have always thought that one of the tragedies of our generation, and one of the causes for more people going off the derech than need be, is failure to make Rav Kook part of the curriculum. I'm talking about in Haredi society. I think that a combination of Rav Kook and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch could make our communities completely different places and better places than what they are today. As far as the particular citation from Rav Kook, yeah, I buy that. I buy that 100%. To have the tools is not the same thing as buying into all of the message. I think it's ironic that we're sort of reversed positions. We had reversed positions today, and that I'm not kidding when I say that the savior of Western civilization, I think I'll go further than Rabbi Sachs, who is one of my heroes, went, and say that it might be the Torah Academy, the yeshiva, which ironically will save the Western Academy and Western society, in that we may be the last people standing to do depth learning, to be able to take text and to read it deeply and intelligently. And increasingly, the world may have to come back to us for our language and our tools.
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Zarim, why don't we conclude with you?
I would never want to disagree with Rav Kook, and I love his ideas, and trying to follow him is always fascinating. I think he's basing the language wisdom debate on that Gemara in Sota, where it talks about the difference of the language and the wisdom. And I would agree, but I would maybe explain the words differently. Why was he against the language? And that actually was against the language. I think it's the other way around in the Gemara, because the Greeks were using it to pass messages. secret messages for the double agents inside Jerusalem and destroying it. And so the issue is not that it's which bits are okay, which not okay, it's how it's used. Knowledge is not essentially good or bad. That's how I look at it. So I never see it as them and us. I always look more fundamental about it. I just don't see it. I've got to be honest. I don't see reality in that way. Reality just is. There's realizations that we have, but what do we do with it? And I think the rabbis were nervous of rhetoric, of persuasion, that Greek art, which changed people's minds in very shocking ways. And the irony is that a lot of outreach or rabbis or teachers who speak publicly, and Rabbi Sachs talked against this, will use rhetoric, be inconsistent, misquote or selectively quote to get the message across. And ironically, it's Greek. It's Greek. It's not good, right? We've absorbed that bad part of it, whereas the reverse should be the wisdom is what we should be engaging. There is nothing wrong with reading classic books of science and philosophy, understanding what they are saying. I think Rav Adlerstein makes a great point that no one bothers to read anything anymore, and that's a deep problem. But I'm sorry, I can't see it as them and us. I don't think the Torah wants us, the way I read Torah, to see that danger in that way. Avraham makes a Brit with another nation. He has a massive argument with Lavan, right? There are arguments with Avimelech. There's differences and similarities, but he gets told off for his mistakes sometimes, for not understanding it. And Yitzchok's incredible influence on these issues, and where he says, I don't care what God says, this is right, and we kind of accept it, and we never said it after him, fascinates me. It was never either or. It's about greatness and smallness. People have ruined universities. Some people have ruined yeshivas as well. We have to find the good in both and reject the bad in both. It's not essentially what is basically good and what is basically bad. Again, if I'm a lost soul of Adlerstein, please correct me, but it just seems to make more sense in that way. And I read Rav Kook recognizing that issue as well. The fact he could look at the light of Rembrandt in the National Gallery and see it as the hidden light of creation is because he was shalem. He had a purity. He could see it. It was there. I can't see it. And so there's certain things I shouldn't look at because I can't see the purity in them. The Gemara's discussion of, can you make a bracha over a beautiful person that you find attractive? Can you identify the beauty without the attraction? The Gemara wrestles with that issue and then comes up with a kind of take you. If you bump into the situation, you can do it. So that's why if I'm in a movie that I think is going to be good and something bad happens, I have learned, and I'm not for it, to look away. I shut my eye. I make the choice not to go to look. Some I won't even go to, but I'm making a havdalah, a choice every time. And I think that's what the Torah is teaching us to do, make havdalot. I can run away, never go to a non-Jewish supermarket, only go to kosher ones. I don't have to think. But then I'm not doing havdalah. I do many more havdalot in a non-Jewish supermarket than I do in a kosher one. And we're meant to do havdalot. The book of Vayikra is built, so I'm getting more passionate on havdalot. So for me, it's about that choice. But I completely agree with Adlerstein. If you're not rooted and grounded, I don't like the fortress imagery because that's military and fighting. But I do like the idea of being grounded in who you are, in your home, and being truly grounded and knowing who you are. Then you can go out into the world.
Certainly, Rabbi Zera, what you just said in terms of the problem of rhetoric is a great way to conclude, because I have always been very, very against political debates where each person is given 3 minutes and then the next person is given 2 minutes to respond. That is not a proper debate. That is not what the Lincoln-Douglas debates were about, where each person was given a serious platform and plenty of time to authentically represent his argument. Modern debates are not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about who can get the best zinger in, so it has nothing to do with truth. Thankfully, I believe that our conversation today at least somewhat approximated the good kind of debate, where people have a chance to really express an opinion and express what they mean and explain what they mean. So while I don't think we came to a conclusion, and while I don't think that we have definitively explored the entire topic, there's plenty more to discuss, I'm very happy with the opportunity to hear a serious conversation about a serious issue, which took place in a stimulating and friendly environment. Rabbi Raphael Hirsch, Rabbi Yitzchok Adlerstein, I thank you.
An honor. Thank you. Wonderful to speak to both of you.
Chanukah, everybody, and I will not call it Happy Saturnalia.
Chanukah is here, and many of us try to fit in a bit of learning for the Chag. But then it hits you. It's also Parshat Miketz. Suddenly there are two topics you want to learn and almost no time for either. What if you could cover both at once and walk away with a genuinely insightful understanding of each? And finally understand a mizmor you say every day. And what if you could do it all effortlessly through a podcast? That's exactly what you get in the Chanukah episode of Tehillim Unveiled, the podcast that uncovers the meaning behind the Tehillim that we say every day. This Chanukah, we explore Tehillim 30, Lamed, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, and show how one Mizmor reveals a deep, coherent connection between Chanukah, Parshat Miketz, and your morning davening, all wrapped up in one incredibly relevant message. Whether you're looking for something to learn by the candles or to squeeze in on your commute, this episode gives you real insight and helps the whole week come together. Find a link to the Chanukah special of Tehillim Unveiled in the description of this podcast, or search for Tehillim Unveiled wherever you get your podcasts. Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.